Yeah.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I see we have quite a number of people coming from every country of the world, so that's great. It's great to see all this diversity. So welcome to this masterclass on systems approaches to agri-food systems transformation. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dalia Mattioni. I collaborate here in FAO with the Agri-Food Systems and Food Safety Division, and I'm also a researcher and a teacher at the University of Pisa and the American University of Rome. So welcome to you all. This lesson has been prepared by no means only by myself. Share with you, if I can, seem to have some problems with the slide. Here they are, my team. First and foremost, our director, Corona Hawkes of the Agri-Food System and Food Safety Division, who's here next to me and who will give some introductory remarks. But then everybody else involved in the preparation of the content of this lesson and the organization of it too. And I also want to thank the World Food Forum colleagues for everything that they've done. Now, a bit on the agenda of the day. So we'll start with a little exercise just to move a little, and we'll be telling you about what we know, what we propose on agri-food systems approaches to transformation. But we want to know also about what you think. So we have a little exercise for you. Then I'll give the floor to Corinna for introductory remarks. Then we'll have the lesson itself. And we'll have a couple of guest speakers who'll tell us about, real life examples of what it means to take a systems approach. And then we will open up to your questions. We'll have a 10-minute slot for those. So if you want to start writing them in the Q&A box, that would be great. We won't be able to reply to all of them, but feel free to write to us after the lesson. We'll be sharing the slides with you where you'll see our emails and you can write to us if you want to engage more together on this topic. So let's start then. Here you see a Mentimeter. So the question is simple. It's just one question. What does a systems approach mean to you? So if you want to put your device, your cell phone on the QR code or access the Mentimeter.com using the code that you'll see here or the link, I'll just give you a few minutes and then maybe we can look at your answers together. So you can write just a word, 2 words, a sentence, whatever comes to your mind on a general systems approach or a food systems approach. If you feel that there's something that you want to share in particular on agri-food systems approach, whatever you feel. It's completely anonymous. So you can really write whatever comes to your mind. If you prefer, you can also use the chat button to share your thoughts on this. we're seeing some answers. So not working in silos, understanding what other actors, what other stakeholders in the system are doing, considering all the food chain from seed to plate. That's very good. It's very interesting because we will be looking at some of these aspects in the next hour that we're together. Understanding stakeholders involved in the system, their role and their contribution. Absolutely, understanding will be a key word that we'll be using. So I see that some of the things we'll be saying will definitely be resonating with you. Production to consumption, yes, we'll be looking at that also. What are the components of a food system and why the system, bringing different backgrounds together to do a systems thinking approach. And we're beginning also to see a cloud appear in the Mentimeter. Here it is, problem solving. Yes, absolutely. Action oriented. That will be a central piece of this lesson. Holistic, yes. Comprehensive, absolutely. Relationships, we'll be looking at interconnectedness. Dialogue, relationships. Institutionalized, that's an interesting also take. Of course, that it doesn't remain marginalized. Food value chain. I think we're seeing very much aspects that we'll be touching upon during the lesson. So it'll be very interesting to also hear your questions and to reflect together upon what we mean by systems approaches and why taking a systems approach is so important. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us. I would like now to, yes, maybe, great, here I am. I would like now to turn it over to Corinna Hawkes. Corinna Hawkes is the director of the Division of Agri-Food Systems and Food Safety, and she will give some introductory remarks to the lecture. So please.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, Dahlia, and thanks very much for joining today. I think you can see me okay. Yes, okay. Great to be here, and thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for joining this masterclass on this critically important topic, which, as you've rightly pointed out, is actually about really solving some of the fundamental issues in our agri-food system. Now, at the start of this masterclass, I'd like to ask you all if you could imagine an agri-food system that functions really, really well to deliver for people, planet, and prosperity. Perhaps think about a food system close to wherever you are now. We're all close in the food system, whether it's the meal that we're about to eat, whether it's a store that we recently visited, whether it's if we like to grow food, whether it's some food growing that we've done, whether it's the job that we have. Whether you're in rural, urban, at work, at home, there's a food system somewhere, everywhere. Now, just imagine if this food system it consisted of farmers, entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized enterprises, big businesses, generating jobs, generating wealth that was equally distributed in local, national, and in the global economy by producing, distributing, trading, selling a diversity of safe, nutritious foods to citizens. And that food was produced in such a way that supported environmental sustainability, helped address climate change, provided solutions to biodiversity. So that's a system that supports our prosperity, our people and our people's health, and our planet. And that is the food system, the agri-food systems that we all want to see. It leads to better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better lives for all. Now, if you take a minute to think about why that might be the case, why would it be? How could we convert what we have now, where the food system is not doing that, to an agri-food system which is delivering all of these goals in synergy? It would mean that everything that people are doing that are involved in food are aligned towards those goals. Food service, food vendors, supermarkets would be selling healthy, safe food, supporting their workers. That was also environmentally sustainable. The same for our large companies or smaller entrepreneurs. The same for our farmers. The same for our citizens who would be wasting less food and eating healthier. Imagine, in other words, that all of the people from farm to fork are working together for collective impact. They're not fragmented. They want the same thing. They have the same purpose. They have a sense of their roles and responsibilities that they have as people and institutions to achieve it. They understand what it is, the actions they need to take. Imagine that the people working together in different parts of the system so that they could align towards these goals. And that they're considering the connections in all of the different parts of the system, whether that's a farmer considering the role of markets, an entrepreneur trying to develop a business that sells healthy food, and remembering always that if they work together, there's a potential not just to achieve their own goals, but to achieve multiple benefits across the system, and addressing some of the tricky trade-offs that sometimes come about when you work in an interconnected system. Imagine that the people of the system had the knowledge that they needed to inform this type of action, that they were incentivized by the resources and investment that they had that were affecting and incentivizing their action. And imagine that since this is quite a hard task, that every once in a while they got together and reflected on how well they're doing and adapted accordingly towards their shared purpose. Just imagine a world like that, a world that would embrace complexity and work collectively to address it and really solve the problems that we face. Now, it's unlikely that any of this will happen and really move towards in this way if the people in the system remain fixated only on their own part of the system without trying to make the connections that they really need to be able to see in order to take this kind of action. For that, we need systems thinking and we need systems thinkers. And we need more of that than ever before, if in order that we're going to make this change. So what we're trying to share here, what I'm trying to visualize here, is a transformation in the way that we think and act, from working to fix the different components and outcomes of agri-food systems in isolation and fragmentation, where people, investments, knowledge are fragmented, to an approach that connects all of the different outcomes and components and people of agri-food systems. And that's what we talk about when we talk about a systems approach. Now, it's an approach that we must take if we are going to solve the problems that we face. And we're going to achieve this well-functioning food system that could deliver so much to improve our lives. It's why we need to advance this approach. It's what this masterclass is all about. And importantly, it may sound quite challenging, but it's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible to start to take this approach and to build on the way that this approach has already been taken, and you'll be hearing a couple of examples about that later. So it's perfectly possible, and what this masterclass will do in Dahlia's masterful hands will take you through how to take this kind of approach and how to build it into everyday work. Thanks very much. I'll pass back to Dahlia.
Thanks, Corinne. Thank you so much for those inspiring words. She's anticipated many of the things that you will hear now in the next slides. So let me dive right into it. There we go. A few seconds of patience. Okay, so we were asked by the World Food Forum team to give an inspirational quote, but I think Corinna's actually given an inspirational introduction. And the key word for us here was imagine. Imagine, because you are the youth. You are the policymakers of the future, the private sector actors, the movers and shakers of the NGO. So we really want you to imagine this future. And I hope that we hope that these slides will stimulate you in this direction. Now, what is the challenge? For some of you, this might be quite obvious, but just for us to be on the same page. So we know where we want to go. We know what sustainable food systems are. So they should be systems that deliver food security and nutrition without being to the detriment of the environment, of social justice, and of healthy diets. But we also know that that's not really happening. that food systems today are not contributing as much as they could to the SDGs. So this is not to say that they are not working at all. Of course, they've improved immensely in the last decades, but we still have a number of challenges, big challenges ahead. And yet, food systems, agri-food systems could contribute strongly to all of the SDGs. So this is a diagram taken from FAO Strategic Framework. It contains the 4 goals of FAO, which is to move towards better life, better nutrition, better production, and better environment. And as you see, each one of these goals in turn contributes to several of the SDGs. So this is something that could happen, but it's not really happening. And that's because the actions that have been taken so far, and many actions have been taken in the course of the last decades, have not really been adding up to the changes that we need. These are just as an example, they've had limited impacts, they've had unintended consequences that were negative, and they've also been of short-term effect. So, for example, we have seen incredible rises of productivity, but at the expense of the environment. Or we've seen projects that, yes, have had an impact, but haven't really been sustained over time. So what this is telling us is that business as usual is not enough. So we need to continue taking action, but the way we take action has to change. But why do we need a systems approach? Why are we talking about systems? So let's just get some of the basics right. So systems, there are many systems. A cell in your body is a system. Your body itself is a system. A machine is a system. A forest is a system. And all systems have certain characteristics in common. So they all deliver a function or a set of functions. They're made up of multiple components. These components are interconnected amongst themselves in some way strongly, in some way weakly, but they are. They also have multiple outcomes that emerge from the way that they interact. Some of them are intended, some are not intended. They interact with interrelated systems, i.e. with the environment or the context in which that system is embedded. They're made up of smaller subsystems, each of which contributes to the way the larger system works. And systems, those that contain people, a machine does not contain people, but those systems, socio-technical systems that contain people, by the very fact that they have people engaged, are also shaped by the power relations and interests different that people have. And last but not least, every system is dynamic. It's never stable or static, and therefore it's characterized by a certain level of uncertainty and unpredictability. Now, agri-food systems are also systems, and they share these characteristics. I won't go through all of these, but I'll just give some examples. For example, they're made up of multiple components. So agricultural practices, transport infrastructure, farmers, ministries of agriculture, policies and rules around food safety, and so on and so on. They deliver multiple outcomes. So as I was saying, they should deliver on food security and nutrition, but also on environment, on economic prosperity. And I've given an example here of fishing, and we'll be hearing more from one of our guest speakers. Fishing subsector is supposed to deliver on food, so provide fish for people, but it also has to provide income for fishers, and it has to maintain, ecologically speaking, the balance of the marine ecosystem. Other examples are related to the context in which food systems function. So they don't function in a vacuum. They very much depend from other adjacent food systems. So for example, if there is a disruption in the energy system, the price of fuel increases, for example, that will have an implication for the agri-food system and vice versa. They're also made up of subsystems. I've just spoken of the fisheries subsystem, but also livestock, food safety, market system. If the market systems don't work, don't perform well, then food simply cannot reach people. So agri-food systems display the characteristics of a system. So the next question might be, okay, well, so what? Yes, agri-food systems are systems. Well, it's important because each characteristic of a system has implications for the way we take action. So for example, if we know that there are many components that interact in an agri-food system, it means that it's complex, that problems cannot be solved by a single intervention. You're likely to have to use an approach which bundles up different actions together, what we call a portfolio approach. or if we're well aware of the fact that there are different people who are involved with varying levels of interest and power and coming from different disciplinary areas, we'll know that making decisions on, for example, how to take a local level food policy will mean setting up inclusive governance structures where people come together and negotiate and find compromises, and so forth for the other characteristics too. So this has led us to come up with this framework. So let me just go through the framework, and then I'll go through each element of the systems approach one by one. I just want to pause briefly to say that if you have any questions, please write them up in the chat, and we will answer them later on. So first of all, we know where we want to go. We want to transform the outcomes of the agri-food system. So this is where we want to go, what's inside the red circle, the 4 betters that lead to the SDGs. But in order to do that, we need to transform the practices. So really what we do in concrete terms. So the way food and agriculture products are produced, distributed, processed, etc. And in order to change the practices, we need to change how we do things. We need to transform the approach whereby we do this. And a systems approach for us is made up of 6 elements, which I will now walk you through. First of all, we've got systems thinking, and Corinne alluded to this in her introductory remarks. We need to, before actually doing anything, have a mindset which is different, no longer siloed, sectoral. You mentioned this in the little exercise we had at the beginning. We need to recognize that we are working in systems and what is our part in the system. So we need to recognize the multiple components, which ones, what they are, possibly measure them, and that can form the basis for what will then be systems doings. Systems doing for us is really about policies and interventions and actions. There are many, many aspects of systems doing. I just want to draw your attention to one of them, which is building portfolios of synergistic action. So we need to make sure that when we take action, as I was alluding to before, it's not just a single action, but we need to set in place a variety of actions that are coherent amongst themselves and move in the same direction. For example, if we want to tackle micronutrient deficiencies in remote and rural areas, that's our problem. It will be more likely to be able to actually tackle this problem by taking a bundle of activities, of actions. So scientific advances through biofortification, financing to make sure poorer consumers can have access to these products, fortification of key products, and then making sure that we have school feeding programs for children to have access to these products. And we briefly touched upon trade-offs. So, and we'll talk about it later with our guest speakers. So, as I've said before, sometimes to reach one of the outcomes of the agri-food systems, the problem in the past has been that it has come to the detriment of other outcomes. So bringing about building a portfolio of synergistic actions can also allow to mitigate that risk, can also allow to mitigate the negative unintended consequences that we can have due to certain actions that we take to reach one of the outcomes. Knowledge is fundamental in this, obviously. Before acting, before doing, we need to know, we need to have the data, we need to have the information. That's why systematic analysis of agri-food system, foresight exercises, scenarios, but also to be able to communicate this well to policymakers, make sure that there is a science policy interface, to make sure that the information we collect doesn't just remain on a shelf. But I want to draw your attention to the issue of inclusivity. When we talk about knowledge, in the past, we've really meant the mainstream Western scientific knowledge. What we mean here, though, is to open up this notion of knowledge and make sure that we also include other types of knowledge. So, for example, in agroecological approaches, and our guest speaker will speak more about this, and farmer field schools, the research agenda is really co-designed together with farmers using their traditional knowledge, using local knowledge, or using indigenous people's knowledge, depending on the context. System of governance is key. As I was saying, there are a variety of actors, stakeholders with varying levels of power involved in making decisions about what we do and how we transform our practices. It's important to bring everybody around the table. It's important to have a shared sense of directionality, set the rules of the game of how decisions will be made so as to be able to navigate conflict and power relations, and undertake joint reflections, planning, and implementation. So examples of these are, for example, Urban Food Policy Council. Some of you may have heard of these. They've been around for now 15 or 20 years in many, many countries all over the world. And they're really inclusive and participatory spaces that bring about different stakeholders coming from, as some of you have said, all the sectors of the food chain. So from farmers to retailing to processing and consumers too. Importantly, they need to include unheard voices that come around the table, but unheard voices also whose views are taken into consideration when decisions are made. Investment is a key pillar here. So the way that investment occurs at the moment occurs along siloed and sectoral ways. We need to be allocating budgets, for example, to incentivize that joint planning that I was talking about, that joint implementation that I was talking about. We need to also have investments that last in time, that consider investments for short-term action, medium-term actions, but also long-term actions to maintain the sustainability of actions in time. And last, but definitely not least, we have systems learning and leadership. Systems learning cuts across all the other elements, really. That's why we placed it in a white background to signify the fact that systems learning is something that occurs throughout. It occurs certainly during the doing, in the knowledge, in the governance elements, and it's a very, very important part of the approach. Why is it? Because we said that systems are not stable, they're not fixed, they're dynamic in time, they're unpredictable and uncertain. This is why it's key to develop at the beginning of the design of a project or a program, moments in time, venues, when people can come together and learn from what is happening and adapt what is happening to as they go along. So establishing mechanisms for learning by doing and fixing indicators to define progress. Another important aspect of learning is capabilities, capacities. So human resource capacities to do that, to manage the systems learning, but also institutional capacities and procedures. So we need to have procedures, bureaucracy, institutions that are agile and responsive enough to be able to adapt to what's coming out from the joint learning that happens. And the same goes for leadership that also has a different way of viewing things. Now, all that I've said is well and good. It's great. And I don't know, you might agree or not, but there are problems. And there are many blockages to the adoption of a systems approach. You've mentioned it in the exercise that we had at the beginning. It's mainly linked to the siloed, sectored nature in which institutions work, all sorts of institutions, public, sometimes private, universities, institutional procedures, bureaucracy, sectoral ways of thinking, and also fragmented financing. So from our point of view, taking a systems approach means working collectively to break down these blockages. So I've spoken a lot. There's a lot on the plate. And I now wanted to hear from people who have actually put a systems approach in practice. This is a work that has been ongoing in the Agri-Food System and Food Safety Division, but we have drawn extensively from throughout FAO. FAO has been for many decades, our colleagues have been using systems approaches in some of their programs and projects, and we wanted to hear from them. So we wanted to have some real life examples of what is happening in FAO. And I've invited here two guest speakers. The first guest speaker is Pierre Ferrand. He's an agricultural officer and he leads the work in FAO in agroecology, and he comes from the Plant Production and Protection Division. And I've also invited Marcelo Vasconcelos, a fishery resources officer, who leads the work on ecosystems approaches to fisheries in the Fisheries and Aquaculture Division. So if I can maybe first invite Pierre. Here he is. Welcome, Pierre. Thanks for being here. So I have a couple of questions for you, Pierre. So I mentioned actually the work that you do when we spoke about knowledge, the knowledge element of a systems approach. I've said that knowledge needs to be inclusive, and I've spoken about agroecology as an important program where you actually co-produce the knowledge together with the farmers. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that. That's my first question. And I also know from previous encounters that we've had that agroecology, you told me, is made up of various disciplines and stakeholders. So if you can tell us a little bit about the governance and what implications that has for making the governance work, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So thank you for the question. Maybe before addressing the question, I'd like to briefly share a little bit on how we understand agroecology in FAO. So agroecology is an integrated approach, and actually it echoes a lot of what you have presented on the approach, the system approach. So it's an integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concept and principle to the design and management of food and agricultural system. So it has increasingly been identified as a crucial enabler of food system transformation. So hence the relevancy requires to meet the SDGs. And agroecology provides a framework to guide the transformation of food system and their governance, and encompassing the whole arrangement of practice from farm to fork, and hence representing a promising strategy to bridge the missing middle between food production and consumption, so producers and consumers. So in order to address this holistic nature of agroecology and the system approach somehow, and the complexity that it represents, FAO has come up with what we call the 10 elements of agroecology. And this is what I will talk about in order to illustrate your question. So these 10 elements, they have emerged through a 4-year regional and international consultative process, which brought together over 2,100 participants from 170 countries through 9 regional and international multi-stakeholder consultation. So this really already highlights the fact how inclusive it was and multi-stakeholder. These 10 elements, they were adopted by the 197 members of FAO in 2019, and it is the only framework about agroecology that has been internationally recognized and endorsed. So the 10 elements can be seen as a guide for policymakers, practitioners, and other stakeholders in the planning, managing, and evaluating the agroecology transition. And as such, they offer different entry points, and this is where I think it echoes very well with the system approach to work to strengthen agroecology and transform the system. So these 10 elements, they are interlinked and interdependent. They encompass the element of diversity and co-creation and sharing of knowledge, which is really central, but also sharing of practice, of science and innovation as foundational characteristic of agroecological system. And this helps to guide the diversification choices, aim at building synergies and minimizing trade-off. So the element of efficiency and resilience are emergent property of the system built upon the 3 above elements, where recycling play a central place. And lastly, we have the element of human and social values and culture and food tradition that describe context picture of agroecological system, while responsible governance, and you mentioned a lot about the governance, and circular and solidarity economy describes the enabling environment, which is critical, and they serve also as an inspirational goal for when we transform the system. So agroecology being context specific and very knowledge intensive, the co-creation and sharing of knowledge is central. And as I mentioned earlier, the very development of the 10 elements has followed this co-creation process involving a lot of different stakeholders all over the world. So through this co-creation of process, agroecology blends traditional and local knowledge, producer and trader practical knowledge, and global scientific knowledge, and producer knowledge of agricultural biodiversity and management experience for specific context, as well as their knowledge related to markets and institution are absolutely central when we want to transform the system. So just to finish, I wanted to share a little bit of the work that we do in FAO through the Agroecology Knowledge Hub, which was established in 2016, and it is meant to help aggregating and disseminating knowledge from within and outside FAO, mostly from outside, actually from all external partners. And to date, we have aggregated over 3,000 resources related to agroecology, hosted through two databases. One that is related to country legislation, agreements, and policies, called the Agroecology Lex, and the repository of resources per se on the Knowledge Hub that aggregates publication, article, but also a lot of multimedia resources. So you can find everything online.
Great. Thank you, Pep. Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating. And it was interesting to hear about how the 10 elements are interconnected one with the other, and to know more about knowledge so central for the work that agroecology is doing. If you have any questions for Pierre, please put them in the chat, because he will be with us also in the Q&A session. My next guest is Marcelo Vasconcelos, as I was saying. Hi, Marcelo.
Hi there.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So as I was saying in the presentation, and I used fisheries as an example, many agri-food systems have multiple outcomes. So in your case, it's food in the form of fish, income, and then the balance, ecological balance of the marine ecosystem. So how have you managed in your project by using the approach that you use to reconcile, if possible, or at least to manage the trade-offs between these?
Right.
Because in previous discussions that we've had, you've mentioned the different the fact that you've been aware of the fact that there are these trade-offs where you've worked, and that the difficulty has been that of squaring them and somehow mitigating them. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
And then I remember that you were also telling me, because we've seen that learning and adaptation is so important when you take a systems approach, because of the complexity, because of the unpredictability of what will be coming out of the system. I remember you telling me about how you've embedded these, let's say, in your programs and projects. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this, difficulties that you may have had.
Okay, thank you again, Dalia, for the invitation. Yeah, like you mentioned, fisheries, I'm going to talk about fisheries most of the time. It's it has multiple purposes, multiple outcomes, let's say, in terms of agri-food systems, no? You mentioned nutrition, of course, super important in certain parts of the world. I can mention livelihoods. We have, recent statistics that we collected throughout the world. It shows like amazing numbers, like almost one in every 10 people in the world is related to fisheries somehow, which is a bit crazy to think, no? Such an ancient activity, still very important in terms of jobs and livelihoods. Food, I mentioned, of course, foreign exchange for many countries. Sometimes we think an island country, for instance, live out of fish in terms of consumption, but the reality shows in many Pacific Island countries, for instance, they use it as export commodity to get foreign exchange. So culturally important in many parts of the world. Who among us haven't fished for recreational purpose? So there is a whole industry behind recreational fisheries as well, which involves boats and different value chains from the normal agri-food systems value chain. So very complex, very, let's say, diverse in terms of outcomes and interests. Of course, we are interested most of all with the nutrition and food security as FAO. No? You mentioned well in your presentation. And the problem is how to square all those outcomes, how you balance that and make it sustainable, which is the other major problem there, no? So we are dealing with systems that different from agriculture. We are dealing with basically what our ancestors used to do, hunter-gatherers. No, we are chasing fish in the ocean with different techniques, right? And it's there are many problems with that. You first of all, fish is free. They don't know boundaries, right? There are no political boundaries. So a fish that is born in Italy goes to Croatia on the other side of the Adriatic and back, and it's harvested by different countries. So we need to square that equation as well when we think about fish and fisheries resources. When we fish, we don't catch only the things that we're looking for, because you cast the net and you catch other things, maybe unintended, and this creates environmental problems, like you mentioned before. So we need to also square that in the equation. And there are large uncertainties in all of this. You mentioned that well in your slide in terms of system thinking, the importance of learning. And here we're dealing with a very complex system, the marine ecosystem, with resources that are mobile and very dynamic and responding to those environmental processes in the ocean. And we still have a very limited knowledge of all of this, how all of this works. No? So it's super important here to be aware of uncertainties and how to deal with that. So the approach we have been working for more than perhaps 20 years with FAO it's called ecosystem approach to fisheries, is basically trying to bring this system thinking to the table, you know, like you mentioned before, super important to start with. Okay, we are dealing with a sector that has different objectives, so let's be explicit about those objectives to start with. Let's identify who is benefiting from it, right? So the stakeholder mapping early on in the phase. Let's understand connections, right? The thing I mentioned about maybe I'm fishing for something that is creating a problem in a part of the system that I didn't think about it before. So, and bringing to the table also the best available knowledge. And here I echo what you mentioned before. I mean, the super importance of traditional knowledge, local knowledge. Again, just to remind us, this is a very old activity, an ancient activity that fishers have a lot of knowledge about what worked and what didn't work in the past in terms of activities and actions. And so bringing them on board on this whole system thinking is super important. And what we have been focused most of the time is to help countries in thinking systemically and building the right, let's say, institutional arrangements and mechanisms to manage fisheries according to that, right? It's not an easy task. We have different experiences in different parts of the world. Some have, achieved successes quickly, others are still lagging behind because there are challenges out there. You mentioned many of them, and in your presentation, we still think in silos in many of our governments. We have our institutions, for instance, a fisheries ministry. Very rarely we'll talk to an agriculture ministry, you know. Whereas there are many impacts among the two activities. You know, if you do something in the watersheds regarding soil use and use of the forests and so forth, it can impact downstreams the marine ecosystems. You know? So these are not really well connected in many places. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of governance. Finance, not mentioned finance, you know, we face this often in the fisheries sector. You see a bank opening a portfolio for buying new vessels or more modern vessels without talking to the ministry that takes care of monitoring the status of resources. So you can actually create a situation of overcapacity, you know? So you're building more vessels than the system can support. So sometimes it's a simple question of communication, sometimes it's a question of understanding what you're doing, you know, systemically. So this is more or less, of course, there is plenty to talk about. Time is short. Uncertainty is how we deal with this, the learning, the importance of learning, you know? So what we try to convey in this process of institutional setup and is the idea of having these management cycles, you know? So the practice in the past has been, okay, I'm going to manage a fishery, I'm going to draw this law saying that the closed season is 3 months and I'm not going to do anything about it. I've done my part, right? sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You need to monitor this over time. So there's different cycles there that you have to build in your system to adapt and learn through time, right? So we insist on having annual cycles of managing and receiving information from your fishers or your scientific research institutes to understand if what you've done is working or not, right? On the short term. So you have to have this cycle annually. But you have to think also long term, because, and that's something maybe to remind our listeners that we are dealing maybe in the last 10 years, we've seen things in terms of climate change, super important. Changes that we've never seen before. Last year was the hottest, this year probably will be even the hottest. And this is affecting marine ecosystems all over the world. We have seen fish in the Mediterranean, where we are sitting now, things that never happened before, like species that were from the Red Sea are now being found in Italy because the sea is getting warmer. So it's a tropicalization effect that is happening here in our garden, let's say. No? And how do you react to this? This is something, so the managers that decided on certain measures 10 years ago, this is perhaps not so relevant anymore, and they have to be quick in reacting to this. No? So we insist on building this medium long-term cycles of learning as well. So whatever you decided today, you have to revise in 5 years because things are changing now. So this is functions that you have to build in order to improve learning and adapt to change through time in the systems. Maybe I'll stop here, maybe answer the questions to clarify other things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcelo. That was great. You mentioned a couple of things that I thought were really interesting, which is you say, make explicit the different outcomes. So really put them on the table. And that's what we meant by systems thinking, really. And you said understand the connections. So understand them and make them explicit, put them on the table so that people will have different views on the relative importance, but it's important to see them and then to make decisions. And also the cycle of management, that's very interesting. It's exactly what we meant when we speak about adapting, learning, and then adapting. And you mentioned an important aspect of climate change, which we haven't really mentioned explicitly. So thanks. I want to thank both my guest speakers. And now we can open the floor to questions. I see that you have written many questions on the Q&A chat. I will ask maybe Corinna if she wants to take some of the questions because she's been looking at them. So, Corinna, the floor is yours if you want to, please.
Thank you. You can hear me okay, I think? Okay, so there's a question here from Romani. Thanks very much, Romani. Particularly speaking about the vision that I outlined at the beginning of this presentation, saying it doesn't take into account people's personal motivations, self-interest, greed, consumer culture, and how a systems approach can deal with this. A systems approach can't explicitly address those problems, but what it can do, it can help understand and identify those problems. So if you actually, in a systems approach, we have to think, okay, if we were to take a certain action, how might it affect someone else in the system, someone else's interest, someone else's motivation, someone else's goal or objectives? So an example might be that if we were to put into place an action that would improve environmental sustainability, but it made food more expensive, then that would undermine people who are wanting to have lower cost food. So that's a clear example of a connection. But it's not so related to a political economy aspect that you're referring to. So an example of that would be if some, say, large company was making a lot of money around selling food which is unhealthy, and there were some efforts designed to reduce the sale of unhealthy food that would affect perhaps the profitability of that company, that would lead to a tension in the system. And that might mean that the company might push back and say, no, I don't want this to be limited because it's going to affect my profits.
And a systems approach can't explicitly deal with that. But what it can try and do is to say, well, why is it? Is it that person because they're self-interested and greedy and horrible? Or is it because that person themselves are in a system which incentivizes that kind of behavior? So you can begin to find out what lies beneath people's motivations, people's apparent greed, people's apparent self-interest. And it opens some doors to perhaps some new ways of dealing with it. So while it can't directly deal with it, it can indirectly open up our minds to try and understand always what lies beneath people's behavior and people's practices by understanding the connections in different parts of the system. So I will, so that's the answer to how I would answer Romana's question. I also wanted, before moving to Pierre and Marcello, to address the question about if there's any peer-reviewed evidence that compares siloed interventions versus a systems approach. We've discussed that extensively, and not especially, one might not say, not put exactly in those terms. And so to a certain extent, you might say, well, this approach that we're proposing is based on a belief rather than actual any evidence. But the evidence that we use to build on as a scientific foundation, the foundation of evidence to advance this approach, is the science of systems. That what we've tended to do in the past is to try and isolate the different parts of the system and apply our scientific knowledge in a way that doesn't acknowledge the connections. And we rather talk about system science, which provides a strong rationale for this kind of approach. But the other part of the evidence is the evidence that if you don't take this approach, you have unintended consequences and elsewhere of the system, as Dalia said at the outset, and also you tend not to have as much impact as you could. But this hasn't been written up in a very clear way yet, which is why we're trying to work on that, so that there's a clear rationale and a clear evidence base for this way of taking action. As we await the kind of systems monitoring and evaluation learning processes that can actually help build this evidence and enable us to correct it and alter the way we think about it and adapt as we learn more about it. I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Corinna. Thank you so much for that. We also have some questions for our guest speakers. So maybe I'll turn the floor to Pierre. There's a question for you. Someone has asked a question on the difference between agroecology and organic farming.
Okay. This is a question that we often have.
Okay.
Is the speaker?
They can
Yeah,
see
yeah.
you. They can
Okay,
see
all
you,
right.
yes.
Well, both organic and agroecology fall under the umbrella of the approach that aim at sustainably transform food system. One of the difference might be because they are really similar somehow in terms of the objective that they pursue. Organic usually focus first on the practice, and maybe where it differs a little bit is that agroecology, as I mentioned, through the 10 element, has a more holistic approach. And one of the key components is in terms of governance and also how to address power relationship inside the system. So it goes much beyond just changing the way we produce, but how we also include all the stakeholders and create more fair system. Although the latest approach of organic is also focusing really on fair system. So, but they are not one against the other. I mean, both contribute to the same objective.
Okay, great, thanks. So there's a certain complementarity. There was also a question for Marcello. I believe it's on the value chain, the fisheries value chain.
I think it was a general question about value addition, how this is important in changing the systems, transforming the systems. And I think it's super important. Whoever asked was nailed an important question there. And we have many examples where to show the importance of this. Fisheries that, for instance, I won't mention countries or anything, but fisheries that, for instance, were harvesting things for certain uses, like I'll give an example, a shellfish, like a bivalve. They were catching this for bait, to be used by recreational fisheries. So in order to make money out of this, they had to catch huge volumes of that shellfish and to sell at a very low value. This created basically incentives for overfishing. So they're over-harvesting their own sources of income, no? And creating environmental problems later on. The experience in this particular case was to transform what was first commercialized as bait into something for human consumption. So introducing this in the diet of people in this locality. Of course, it's not easy to sometimes to introduce new food items into the diet. So in this particular location, they did different things, like the bundle of measures that you mentioned before. One of them was to invite chefs, no, like to make maybe picking experiences from other countries and see, look, this is, you can eat this in this way, and then transform the use into something different. And this was a success. So whatever was being sold before as bait, it started to be sold as fish for consumption with a higher value. And of course, you have a higher level of income coming from that fishery, and you don't need to fish as hard as you used to be. So that created a positive incentive in terms of uses, no? Of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to have, in this particular case, was a successful story because they had a very organized group of stakeholders, right? They were organizing associations, right? Very good linkages between the research institutes, the fishers organizations, and the government, right? And optimal situation in terms of investment here, and in terms of bringing all these elements, including the chef that came to introduce these concepts and so on. So this whole bundle of measures allowed them to take benefit of value-adding activities in order to transform the systems into something more sustainable and more profitable. No? So that's and it's not unique of that locality. We found it in different localities around the world. This is something exercise that we are doing now, is that looking at experiences with this systemic approach to fisheries across the world and seeing similarities, what are the commonalities, to help us FAO also in terms of, okay, where can we invest more time and resources to leverage these systems? No? So understanding the blockage, like you mentioned before, the challenges, could be a way for us to also, incentivize and accelerate the take-up of a systemic approach. No?
Yeah.
And this is a particular point. I think we are now working within our division in terms of linking more the management side of fisheries to the value chain side, to see how we can understand those value-adding alternatives and how this can link back to your sustainable use.
Okay. Great, thank you, Marcelo. I hope that was useful for the person. There's one question, but I see we only have 1 minute. I'm wondering if, okay, quickly.
Okay, so the question, you have it now? All right. So the question is about policy coherence and how countries are integrating agroecology in their agri-food policy and action plan.
Okay.
So there is a rising interest in agroecology for transforming food system. And in 2021, there was a UN Food System Summit. And in this framework, a coalition on agroecology to transform food system was launched. And what is interesting is now, 3 years later, we have 50 countries which have already joined the coalition. The latest one was Laos in August. And some of these countries are taking very concrete measures to integrate agroecology. I would just take the example of Vietnam, for instance, who has developed their whole national action plan to transform food system and has incorporated agroecology as really their approach to deliver on this transformation. On a different level, because this is really led by government. In Latin America, the network of all the parliaments of Latin America and the Caribbean, so it's more on the legislative process, has also embarked in a process of 2-3 years with the support of FAO to develop a model law on agroecology. So we can really see that slowly, agroecology is really incorporated either by the executive or the legislative body of the countries.
Great. Thanks, Pierre, for that. That was very interesting, because that's when you can, I refer back to that word institutionalized that we saw at the very beginning in the cloud. So this idea that then it becomes something which has a greater chance of becoming sustainable in time. So thanks. I want to thank my speakers, Marcelo, Pierre, thank you for taking time to be here to illustrate with real life examples. I want to thank all the team again. I want to thank Corinna, the organizers. I want to thank you for taking the time to follow this lesson. And we will be sharing the slides with you, and you will find our emails there. So whatever question you want or follow up, please let us know. Corinna, if you want to give some final words, please do so.
Thank you very much. Just to say, if there's any feedback, we're still evolving how to present and how to communicate this approach, and so we're evolving all the time and trying to learn from those who we're speaking with. So please don't hesitate to send any thoughts that we can, as I said, improve the way that we communicate, and also reflect in your own work and whatever you're doing in your everyday life about how you think you might be able to start making more connections in the system in order to be more effective and in the change that you're trying to make. We all work, most of us in the agri-food system, with our, not just with our minds, but with our hearts. We all want to have impact. So by taking this approach, we can all be more effective in working better together. So thank you.
Thanks again. Bye everyone. Bye.